Late one afternoon at Autumn Ridge Park, Harper Nolan was sitting on a bench by the lake quietly reading her paperback novel. The sun was dipping low, casting long shadows across the walking path. Suddenly, two uniformed officers emerged from beneath the oaks. One was older, his face weathered by years under the sun and a lifetime of tough work. He carried himself with a challenge in his eyes. Beside him stood a younger officer who looked uncertain, as though he wasn't quite sure whether to grin or stay serious. "Got any identification?" the older man asked, voice low and taunting. "You could be loitering, might be casing the place." Harper felt a chill run down her spine. She lifted one hand, slowly reaching into her tote bag for her wallet, and gently produced her driver's license. Before she could even explain, the older officer flicked his baton against her dress, hem sending a quick, humiliating flash of skin into the late afternoon light. Harper gasped and clutched the skirt in both hands, her face flushing with shock. "What in heaven's name do you think you're doing?" she demanded, voice trembling but firm. The officer simply laughed. "Lighten up, sweetheart. We're just having a little Sunday fun." He dismissed her protest with a mocking smile, as if her very outrage was an inconvenience to his plans. Meanwhile, the younger officer stood by, avoiding her eyes and shifting uncomfortably. He knew something was wrong, but seemed reluctant to step in. Harper felt a deep ache of indignation mingled with a familiar knot of fear that tugged at her memory. Years earlier, she'd lived in a foster home where silence often meant survival. In that moment, she suddenly recalled the tremor of helplessness she once felt, now replaced by a resolute understanding that she would not remain silent again. Harper rose to her feet, an anger flaring in her chest as she stared resolutely at the older officer. "You think you can treat anyone this way?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the tremor she felt inside. The officer's lips curled into a sneer. "Not anyone," he replied, leaning close enough that she could smell the leather of his belt and the faint tang of his aftershave. "Just girls like you." His words landed like blows, as though he were daring her to respond with violence. But Harper had learned long ago that strength did not always come from force. Instead, as she reached calmly into her tote for her cell phone, with composed precision, she tapped Carmen's number and held the device to her ear. When Carmen answered with a single measured word, where Harper felt her pulse steady in her throat. "Autumn Ridge Park," she said quietly, hugging the phone as though it were a lifeline. "Bench by the east playground." Carmen's voice, low and certain on the other end, told her not to move, that she would arrive in 15 minutes. As Harper ended the call, she let her shoulders relax, turning her gaze back to the placid lake just beyond the worn wooden bench. The late afternoon light shimmered on the water, every ripple reminding her of the lessons she'd learned long ago. In her mind, she replayed the memory of Carmen's gentle words when she'd been a frightened 12-year-old in that filthy foster home. "You don't have to stay here." Today, that same principle guided her. Fear would not dictate her life. Sitting down again, Harper folded her skirt neatly over her knees and rested her hands in her lap. She did not waver or break. Instead, she stared at the still surface of the lake, determination coiling within her like a spring. Whatever happened next, she knew this: she would honor Carmen's teaching by facing her fear head-on. The park around her was quiet, but Harper's resolve roared in her heart. Captain Carmen Delgado guided her Dodge Charger down the dusty service road into Autumn Ridge Park, arriving ahead of schedule. She wore her department-issued baseball cap and aviator sunglasses, a mix of uniform and plain clothes that drew little attention but commanded instant respect. Her crisp navy shirt, dark jeans, and polished boots spoke of readiness, while the badge clipped at her belt glinted in the late afternoon sun. As she parked, her mind drifted back to the first time she'd laid eyes on the young girl she now knew as Harper. 8 years ago, Carmen had answered a welfare check at a rundown foster home. There she'd found a scrawny 12-year-old huddled by a broken radiator, fear trembling in her wide eyes. Carmen had knelt beside her, voice calm but firm, and said, "You don't have to stay here anymore." In that moment, something shifted in the girl's posture and lifted the weight from both hearts. That memory had stayed with Carmen since the knowledge that even a single kind word could rescue someone from a lifetime of silence. Now, hearing Harper's shaken voice on the phone, "He lifted my skirt." Carmen felt a cold fury take root. She parked in the shaded lot reserved for official vehicles, flipped off the engine, and watched two uniformed officers standing near Harper's bench. One officer, older and bulkier, exuded a bullying arrogance. The other, younger and uneasy, eyes flickering with guilt. Carmen straightened her back and stepped away from her charger. With each determined stride, her presence felt like an approaching clock's final seconds, ticking toward long overdue justice. Harper remained seated by the lake, hands folded tightly in her lap, but her gaze flicked up as Carmen drew near. Carmen did not speak immediately. Instead, her measured steps and steely stare announced her arrival with more authority than any word could offer. Time seemed to pause in that moment, as though the park itself held its breath, waiting for Carmen's next move, knowing that when she intervened, the balance would shift irrevocably in Harper's favor. When Carmen Delgado stopped 10 paces short of the two officers, her posture was rigid, her gaze unwavering. She asked in a low, unwavering tone, "What are your badge numbers?" Garrett Stone, the older officer, whose arrogance seemed as worn as his sun-leathered face, smirked and replied, "And who might you be?" Carmen reached into her pocket and pulled out her identification, an internal affairs badge that glinted in the last light of day. The nameplate read, Sergeant Carmen Delgado, and beneath it, the gold shield of the department. The moment her credentials were clear, the air crackled with tension. Colin Rivers, the younger officer who had lingered nervously at Stone's side, swallowed audibly and glanced at Carmen before stammering, minds recharging back at headquarters. His voice was thin, betraying the anxious knot in his stomach. Without another word, Carmen turned to Harper, her expression softening just enough. "Are you all right?" she asked gently. Harper nodded, her hands still clasped tightly in her lap, but her eyes betrayed relief at seeing someone she trusted. From a small cluster of onlookers, an elderly man cleared his throat and stepped forward. His voice was steady, even as his hands trembled slightly in his pockets. "I saw it," he said. I watched Stone flick up her skirt without cause. Carmen's jaw tightened as she absorbed this confirmation. She then addressed Stone directly, her voice cutting through the afternoon stillness like a gavel. "If you lacked probable cause," she said, "then what you had was opportunity, not justification." Stone's smirk faltered under her scrutiny. The power in Carmen's presence, the authority of her badge, and the weight of public witness rendered his bravado powerless. Harper sat a little straighter, as though the very atmosphere acknowledged that injustice would no longer be tolerated. In that charged moment, Carmen's words made clear that honor required more than a uniform. It demanded accountability beginning here and now. Carmen stepped forward, and her voice, firm and unwavering, instructed both officers to remove their badges and surrender their weapons. By now, a small crowd had gathered, drawn by voices and the shine of flashing phone cameras. As Carmen spoke, parents walking nearby paused with children in tow, and joggers slowed to see what was unfolding. Their curiosity turned into solemn attention as they witnessed a pair of sworn officers facing their own sergeant's orders. Colin Rivers, his hand trembled as he unbuckled his holster. He offered his badge first, then his service revolver, placing both gently into Carmen's outstretched hands. Each movement came with a barely audible clink that echoed in the hush. Garrett Stone, however, stood rigid, jaw tight, eyes darting between Carmen and the growing circle of onlookers. He clenched and unclenched his fists, burrowing his glare into Carmen's calm expression. Finally, with a harsh snort and a muttered curse, he yanked his badge from his uniform shirt and tossed it onto the back of the bench. His service firearm followed, landing with a heavy thud that seemed to rattle the very air. Carmen placed both sets of accoutrements on a nearby picnic table, her posture unwavering. She then leveled her gaze at the two men and announced the charges: abuse of authority, harassment, misconduct under color of law, and violation of civil rights. Every word landed with quiet yet undeniable force. The crowd pressed in tighter, filming each moment, capturing Carmen's calm determination and Harper's steadfast presence. Standing beside Carmen, Harper spoke clearly. "Silence does not protect, it permits." Her voice carried over the murmur of the gathering, reminding everyone that bearing witness was a moral act. Carmen nodded and addressed the bystanders. "If you saw what happened, please stay to provide your statements. Your voices matter." As the afternoon light began to wane, the circle of witnesses closed in, resolute in their role, ensuring that what had been done in the shadows would not be forgotten. 3 weeks after the trial concluded, the park had transformed into a tapestry of crimson and gold as autumn leaves drifted down onto the benches and pathways. The same bench where the incident had taken place now felt different, quieter, more resolute. Harper returned to it that afternoon, clutching a blue folder embossed with the simple title, "The Silent Stand." Inside were 36 signed registrations, mostly high school girls, but a few older women as well, each one seeking a place where they could share their stories. find solidarity, and begin to heal. As she sat, Harper felt the weight of both grief and hope coiling within her chest. Around her, the rustling oaks whispered reminders of change. Seasons shift, and so can people. Taking a steadying breath, she flipped through the pages one last time, tracing each signature as though it were a promise. These women she knew had placed their trust in her, that trust would not be misplaced. Footsteps crunched on the carpet of dry leaves. Harper looked up to see Carmen approaching with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Carmen's uniform was neatly pressed, but beneath her jacket was the emblem of the Victim Support Liaison Unit, a role she had requested just days after the verdict. Harper offered a small, grateful smile as she accepted her cup, its warmth seeping into her hands. "I transferred back to community liaison work," Carmen said softly, settling on the bench beside Harper. She took a careful sip and continued, "I believe in what you've started here. True change comes from people standing together, sharing their truths." Carmen's eyes held a steady kindness that reminded Harper of the day she was rescued from her foster home years ago when Carmen knelt before her and simply declared she was free. The 2 women sat in companionable silence, each sip of coffee punctuating their shared understanding. The park's gentle sounds, the distant laughter of children, a dog's soft bark felt like applause for their quiet resolve. They both knew the journey ahead would be long. But in that moment, with Fall's crisp air enfolding them and the signatures of 36 brave souls resting between them, they also understood that this was only the beginning. 3 weeks after the jury returned their verdict, Garrett Stone was led out of courtroom 3B in handcuffs. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as onlookers murmured quietly among themselves. Stone's eyes darted left and right, panic etched into his face. Carmen Delgado stood a few yards away, watching his every step with calm resolve. In that moment, she understood that everything he once held dear, his badge, his reputation, his self-respect, had been irreparably shattered. As Stone passed, Carmen did not glower or taunt. Instead, she simply observed his uniform pressed, but now utterly hollow. The swagger of authority replaced by a defeated shuffle. The brass shield on his chest, once a symbol of safety and order, now lay obscured by handcuffs and public disgrace. She felt neither triumph nor glee, only a solemn recognition that justice had found its mark. At the same time, Colin Rivers stood before a different audience, the Internal Affairs hearing room, where he had pleaded to a suspended sentence and demotion. His eyes were red and he appeared tired but alert. When Carmen approached him afterward in a narrow hallway, he offered a humble nod. "I hope my testimony helped," he said, voice quiet but earnest. Carmen regarded him for a long moment before responding, her tone gentle but firm. "You didn't save her in that moment," she said, "but at least you stopped denying what happened." Rivers' shoulders sagged as though the weight of his choices had just begun to settle in. His silence now felt redemptive, a small but significant step toward owning his mistakes. Around them, murmurs of support and relief rippled among colleagues and witnesses. In this hush, Rivers' quiet acceptance of responsibility was met with a soft but genuine encouragement. It was clear that although his past could not be undone, his willingness to speak the truth offered the first glimmer of a path forward, one where accountability, however imperfect, might eventually lead to healing. Late one crisp afternoon, Carmen and Harper returned to Autumn Ridge Park, not to celebrate, but to see how the place had changed. The same bench where Harper had once sat in fear now looked peaceful, framed by trees just beginning to turn amber. The air felt different, no longer heavy with tension, but calm as a quiet invitation to breathe. Harper lowered herself onto the worn wooden plank, her hands resting lightly on her lap. She glanced at Carmen and asked softly, "Did you ever think it would end like this?" Carmen paused, watching a lone squirrel scurry across the path, then answered with a gentle shake of her head. "No," she said, "but I never imagined you would be the one to finish it." Harper offered a small smile, one that held both relief and wonder. She lifted her gaze to the lake's surface, reflecting the late-day glow. "I thought I would feel angry," she admitted. "But now I feel clean, like I finally stepped out of something more toxic than I ever realized." Carmen nodded, understanding exactly what Harper meant. Years of carrying shame and fear had given way to something lighter, a sense that truth had cleared the air, allowing them to stand in a place that once felt unsafe and now felt almost gentle. As they stood to leave, Harper ran her fingers over the carved initials, her own and Carmen's, from that first moment they had met 8 years ago. The bench itself looked unchanged, weathered wood, familiar grooves, but Harper's memory of it had been transformed. Together they walked along the leaf-strewn trail, each crunch underfoot, a reminder that nothing about that place or their lives would ever be the same. But instead of being a place to hide from Autumn Ridge Park, now felt like a quiet promise that healing is possible and new beginnings can bloom even where pain once grew. Late October in Autumn Ridge brought fiery red leaves carpeting the ground, and Harper sat beneath a grand maple, her folder marked "The Silent Stand," resting gently in her lap. The bench they had once shared loomed behind her, its wood worn but steady, offering a quiet place to reflect. Her volunteer program's simple handwritten title reminded her that silence once broken could become a beacon for others. Carmen arrived softly carrying 2 steaming cups of coffee from the small cafe downtown. She slid onto the bench beside Harper, eyes bright with anticipation. "We've got 36 sign-ups," she said, voice low, as the wind rustled through branches above them. Harper smiled, imagining the faces of teenagers and women from every corner of Autumn Ridge, some high school girls, a few mothers, and older women who had quietly carried their stories for too long. Carmen sipped her coffee and continued, "It's not just for young girls like you. It's for women like Sharon Jordan and all the others we've met." Harper felt warmth spread through her chest, knowing that the Silent Stand would gather those voices together and give them strength. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, folded slip of paper Mongo had brought it over. On it, a young girl's shaky handwriting read, "You are the reason I believe girls can be brave." Tears pricked Harper's eyes, not from anguish, but from the gentle affirmation that her courage had rippled outward. She looked at Carmen, who offered a reassuring nod. Harper pressed the paper to her heart and whispered, "I'm not alone." In that moment, the maple's branches seemed to bow as if acknowledging their promise. A community willing to listen, speak, and stand together. As dusk settled and the park's lamps flickered on, Harper and Carmen sat in peaceful silence, each knowing that the Silent Stand was more than a program. It was a living testament to the power of honest shared voices. Late autumn had drenched Autumn Ridge in brilliant reds and golds, and Harper walked slowly toward the same bench where everything had begun, the crisp leaves crunching underfoot. She held a small slip of paper in her hand, just a few simple words, carefully written. "You changed something." "Thank you." When Carmen arrived, they sat side by side on the familiar wooden seat, its surface warmed by memory rather than sun. Harper held out the note, a quiet smile in her eyes. Carmen smiled back, then reached into her pocket and drew out a small brass pin shaped like an open eye. Carmen explained that long ago a mentor had told her justice isn't about revenge, it's about remembering. Gently, Carmen pinned it to Harper's coat. As the wind stirred the leaves overhead, Harper felt the weight of that message settle warmly in her heart. She tucked the pin close, knowing that every woman who joined the Silent Stand would wear a similar reminder, healing and hope, come from speaking the truth and never letting it be forgotten. They rose together from the bench and began down the leaf-strewn path, each footstep stirring up the season's colors. Harper's folder, The Silent Stand, was tucked under her arm, overflowing with names and hopes. Each signature, each membership served as a promise that silence would no longer protect injustice. Ahead, the trail wound toward the park's exit, and in that moment, both women felt the gentle shift of something larger taking place, a community awakening to the quiet power of shared stories. As they walked out of the park, the maple trees released a final handful of leaves that drifted down around them, reminding them how change spreads soft at first, but unstoppable once it begins. And so in Autumn Ridge that evening, the lingering hush took on new meaning. It was the silence of justice carried forward, refusing to let wrongs remain unseen. 1 year has passed since the first leaves of autumn fell at Autumn Ridge, and life here carries a gentler rhythm now. The bench where everything began still bears its faint mark of that day's struggle, but it has become a place of quiet purpose rather than painful memory. The Silent Stand has grown into a modest community center at the edge of the park, a simple welcoming space painted a soft sage green with chairs arranged in a circle and shelves lined with notebooks, resources, and tokens from those who have shared their stories. Each Wednesday afternoon, women of all ages gather in that room. High school students, some still nervous, sit beside grandmothers who learned of the center only after the summer news cycle faded. They talk, sometimes through tears, sometimes with laughter, but always with respect and understanding. Volunteer mentors, many of them survivors themselves, listen and guide, passing around paper and pens so everyone can jot down thoughts if words come hard. On one wall hangs a bulletin board filled with photos from the first silent stand meeting, Harper and Carmen standing under the maple tree, Sharon smiling shyly beside her daughters, and Jordan, now 17, holding his head high. In her new role as community liaison, Carmen Delgado finds that her days move between the station and the center. She still wears her uniform when duty calls, but she chooses a simple navy blazer and jeans for her afternoons at the silent stand, knowing that her presence offers more comfort than any formal badge. Harper, now a senior in high school, helps lead the youth support group. Her quiet confidence has become a beacon for girls who once felt too small to speak. Many evenings passers-by paused by the bench reading the small plaque Carmen had placed there. Here voices were heard and power changed hands. Autumn Ridge itself seems to have learned this lesson too. The park's playground hums with children's laughter each afternoon, and neighbors nod respectfully when they pass each other on the trails. Local news outlets now mention the silent stand as a model for other communities, and city leaders quietly consult Carmen and Harper when crafting new policies on officer training and civilian oversight. One autumn evening, as the sun sets behind the maple's glowing leaves, Harper and Carmen walk the path together. No words needed, for the air already carries the unspoken truth. The silence of that one quiet stand became a promise kept for many. Note, this story is entirely fictional and created for the purpose of raising awareness. It highlights issues of responsibility, justice, and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. We firmly oppose violence, prejudice, and injustice in all forms. Viewer discretion is advised.